A liberal TV host thought it would be funny to mock Morgan Freeman's broken front tooth on live television. But the legendary actor's response left everyone speechless. Instead of reacting with anger or embarrassment, Freeman's unexpected comeback turned the entire moment on its head. Watch as the audience, the host, and even Freeman himself react in real time. This is a must-see moment. The studio was buzzing with energy as the live show aired. The host, a popular liberal TV personality in his late 40s, was known for his biting wit. He had made a career out of poking fun at the most unexpected targets. Today, however, his target was none other than Morgan Freeman, the legendary actor known for his wisdom and commanding voice. As the cameras rolled, the host couldn't resist making a joke about Freeman's broken front tooth, something that had been noticeable in some recent interviews. "Look at that, folks. Morgan Freeman's tooth is practically the only thing he hasn't fixed with all those movie roles," the host chuckled, looking directly into the camera. Laughter rippled across the audience, but something was off. The tone felt colder than usual. Morgan Freeman, now 87 years old, sat in the chair across from the host. His face remained stoic, but the tension in the air grew thick. The room went silent for a moment. It was a moment of discomfort, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the laughter from the host continued, Freeman leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just a touch. The world would soon see that Freeman's wisdom and experience were more than enough to handle such a lighthearted jab. The host, a little too pleased with his own joke, awaited Freeman's reaction. He was expecting the usual. Maybe Freeman would play along, brush it off, or even laugh it off. After all, the host had seen the actor's calm demeanor in countless interviews before. But today, something was different. Something about Freeman felt more intense. For a split second, the camera caught Freeman's expression, and it seemed to ripple with an emotion too deep to explain. The actor wasn't angry, but there was a profound sadness behind his eyes that no one had noticed before. The host, oblivious to the shift, continued with his banter. "Come on, Morgan. Is that tooth giving you trouble on the set? Don't worry. I'm sure you can fix it with a big check from Hollywood." The audience laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow, as though the joke had missed its mark. Freeman didn't speak immediately. His eyes seemed to be reflecting on something far beyond the moment, the kind of wisdom only time and experience can bring. The room was waiting, the audience on the edge of their seats. This was no ordinary interview. The air was thick with something far deeper than entertainment. The room was still. There was an uncomfortable pause as Freeman leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on the host. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply exhaled, his voice quiet but filled with authority that only someone of his caliber could carry. "You know," Freeman began, his voice soft but firm, "I've lived through many things, far more than you might imagine." He looked around the room, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though his words were meant not just for the host, but for everyone watching. The studio lights seemed to dim, the audience holding their breath, not sure what to expect next. "I've been blessed, truly blessed," Freeman continued, his eyes now locked on the host's. "And in all my years, I've come to realize that sometimes it's not the flaws we see that define us, but the way we embrace them." For a moment, the host was stunned. He had expected humor, a sharp retort, or even anger. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. Freeman's words pierced through the air, cutting deeper than any joke could. The audience was in shock. No one had ever seen Freeman respond like this. The silence stretched on, and it wasn't long before the host realized just how far he had crossed the line. The impact of Freeman's words lingered, and the weight of the moment hit everyone in the room, including the host himself. The laughter had faded, replaced by something far more profound. The host, still caught off guard by Freeman's unexpected response, felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. The audience, which had been laughing moments before, now sat in stunned silence. The laughter had died, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to swallow up the entire studio. Freeman's eyes were deep and piercing. It wasn't just the wisdom that came with age. It was something more. Something that could only come from a life filled with both hardship and triumph. His gaze lingered, as though he was waiting for the host to understand the gravity of his words. The host tried to laugh it off. "Well, Morgan," he said, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Guess I might have gone a little too far." But it was clear that the humor had left the room. His voice faltered. The usual bravado was gone. Freeman's calmness only added to the tension. He didn't say another word, but instead looked down at the table, his expression unreadable. The host sat there unsure of what to do. He had made a joke, but it felt like something far more important had just been revealed, something he wasn't prepared for. As the silence stretched on, Freeman finally spoke again. His voice, though soft, carried a weight that seemed to echo throughout the room. "You see, son," Freeman began, his tone not angry but filled with the kind of patient understanding that only someone of his life experience could convey. "This tooth, it's just a small thing, a tiny piece of me that's broken." He paused, looking down at the floor. "But I've come to realize that broken things are often the most beautiful." The host blinked, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had thought Freeman would get defensive, or perhaps brush it off with a smile. But this was different. Freeman wasn't just talking about a tooth. He was talking about something far deeper. "As I've grown older, I've learned that it's not the perfect smiles or the unblemished lives that matter," Freeman continued, his eyes locking onto the host's. "It's how we handle the broken parts of ourselves that truly define us." The host's face softened. There was something in Freeman's words that was beginning to shift his perspective. The entire audience could feel it too, like a wave of emotion that had quietly crept in, pulling everyone into its embrace. Freeman sat back in his chair, still calm, still composed. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made it clear he wasn't just speaking from a place of experience. He was speaking from a place of deep, personal understanding. The host, feeling the heat of the moment, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had spent so many years cracking jokes and making fun of the world, never really understanding the true impact of his words. But now, in the face of Freeman's calm wisdom, it was as though the veil had been lifted. Freeman's voice softened even more. "We all carry our wounds. We all have parts of ourselves that we wish were different. But those imperfections, they are what make us human." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the host's. "You see, young man, the world isn't made of perfect people. It's made of people who learn to embrace their flaws and grow from them." For the first time, the host felt his own walls begin to crumble. The bravado he had once hidden behind was slipping away, and in its place, something vulnerable, something real, began to emerge. The audience watching the scene unfold could feel the change in the air, like a storm about to break, but in the most beautiful way. The studio felt heavy as Freeman's words hung in the air. There was a kind of stillness, the kind that makes your heart feel a little too big for your chest. The host, for the first time in his career, was speechless. It was as though he had been handed a mirror, but the reflection he saw was nothing like the one he had expected. Freeman, 87 years old, had lived a life that spanned the glory of Hollywood, the pain of loss, and the wisdom that comes with age. He had seen it all. Yet here he was, offering a lesson that the host never thought he'd hear. The audience was equally caught off guard. They had expected to see a famous actor laugh at a joke, maybe even make a witty comment of his own. Instead, Freeman had given them something far more precious. A glimpse into the heart of a man who had learned, perhaps the hard way, that strength doesn't come from being perfect. As the seconds passed, the host sat there, his smile gone, his mind racing. Was there more to this than just a joke? Was he part of something bigger than himself now? The host cleared his throat, trying to gather his composure. "Morgan," he began, his voice softer than before. "I didn't mean to upset you. I guess I thought it was just a joke." Freeman nodded slowly, understanding that the host wasn't coming from a place of malice. "It's all right," he said, his voice as steady as always. "We all make mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes have the power to teach us something important, if you're open to it." The host blinked, still processing. He had spent years making jokes about things that didn't matter, mocking celebrities, poking fun at the world around him. But now, faced with Freeman's wisdom, the weight of his own words became undeniable. The audience was no longer just watching an interview. They were witnessing something rare, a real, raw moment of growth. For some, it felt like a turning point in their own lives, a reminder that it's never too late to learn, to change, to be better. Freeman's voice broke the silence again. "Sometimes, we think our flaws define us, but it's how we carry them that truly makes us who we are." The host was struggling to find the right words. He had mocked Freeman's tooth, but now he realized that Freeman's whole life, his career, his struggles, his triumphs, had been shaped by far more than a small imperfection. It was free. The room was still. The host, once brimming with confidence, now sat in uncomfortable silence, staring at the floor. He had never imagined that one small comment would cause such an overwhelming shift. Freeman's wisdom, as heavy as it was, had left a mark on him, one that could not be erased with a simple apology. Freeman, 87, didn't speak again immediately. He wasn't angry. There was no sense of retaliation in his presence. He simply observed, as though he had lived through enough to know that sometimes the best response is no response at all. His broken tooth, once the subject of mockery, had become a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. The host, feeling the weight of Freeman's silence, slowly began to understand. His career had been built on making light of others' flaws, but here, in front of him, was an icon who had embraced his imperfections. Freeman's life had been far from easy. He had faced unimaginable pain and loss, but he had never let it break him. The host's heart began to pound, a sense of guilt washing over him. How had he not seen this before? The studio's lights felt warmer now, almost suffocating in their intensity. The host shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. The audience, once captivated by the playful banter, now sensed that something deeper was unfolding. No one was laughing anymore. This wasn't just an interview. It was a life lesson in real time. Freeman, still calm, finally broke the silence. "You know, I've had a lot of time to reflect on the things people find funny, or think are worth making fun of." His voice was gentle but carried the weight of a lifetime. But what people often forget is that the things we laugh at can sometimes be the things that carry the deepest meaning. The host looked up, meeting Freeman's eyes for the first time. He had never seen such a piercing gaze. It was as if Freeman could see right through him, into the very core of his soul. "Laughter has its place," Freeman continued, "but there's also room for understanding, for compassion, and for growth." For the first time, the host understood. His laughter had been a shield, a way to mask his own insecurities, to distract himself from the parts of himself he didn't like. The host swallowed hard. He had spent years building a career based on sarcasm, humor, and sharp words. But in this moment, facing Freeman, he realized that it had all been a mask. Beneath the jokes and the fast-paced banter, there was a deeper emptiness he had been running from. Morgan Freeman, with his broken tooth, his wisdom, and his years of life experience, had given him a gift that he never expected. The host suddenly felt small, but in a way that was humbling. Freeman wasn't just an actor, he was a teacher, a guide. Freeman smiled gently as though he knew exactly what the host was thinking. He had been there before. He had walked through his own struggles, and now he was offering the host a chance to see things differently. "It's never too late to change," Freeman said softly, his eyes kind. "We all have our battles, but it's how we face them that defines us." The host nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He didn't know what to say. But for the first time in his life, he knew that words weren't enough. He had to live the lesson Freeman had just taught him. The host, still grappling with the weight of Freeman's words, felt something shift deep within him. For years, he had built his career by making jokes at the expense of others, masking his own insecurities behind a smile. But now, in front of him, was a man who had lived through more than he could imagine, yet stood there unbroken. Freeman, even at 87, exuded a strength that came not from physical power, but from the wisdom of a life well lived. The host's throat tightened. His usual confident, almost cocky demeanor was now replaced by a raw vulnerability. "I never meant to hurt you, Morgan," he said softly, his voice quivering slightly. "I thought it was just a joke, a harmless jab. But now, I don't know. I feel like I've missed something important." Freeman looked at him, his expression gentle, as though he understood the host's inner struggle. "It's never too late to learn," Freeman said. "Sometimes the hardest lessons come when we least expect them. But they are the ones that shape us." The words hung in the air. The host wasn't sure what to say. He had thought of himself as a witty, sharp man. But now he felt small in the face of Freeman's quiet wisdom. For a moment, the host could barely look at Freeman. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything. How had he come to this point? His whole career had been built on making light of others' flaws, but now, standing in front of Freeman, he saw things differently. There was a shift in the air, something unspoken but deeply felt by everyone in the studio. The audience, too, could feel the change. The tension was palpable. It wasn't just a TV show anymore. It was a moment of true connection, of vulnerability, and of learning. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was replaced with a kind of awe, a silent respect that had not been there before. Freeman smiled kindly, and for the first time the host saw the depth of his character. It wasn't about the broken tooth or the imperfections in the world. It was about the ability to stand tall despite them, to own them, and to continue forward with grace. "I want you to understand," Freeman said, his voice soft but steady, "that we all have our scars, both physical and emotional. It's how we carry them that defines us." The host sat in stunned silence, his heart pounding in his chest. It was as though Freeman had unlocked something deep inside him, a realization that he had been running from for years. His entire life, he had used humor to hide from the hard truths. But now, faced with the incredible wisdom of a man who had seen it all, he could no longer ignore the truth. Freeman wasn't just a star. He wasn't just a figure to be admired for his movies and his fame. He was a man who had lived through the loss of loved ones, who had endured the trials of age, and yet, here he stood, a symbol of resilience and strength. For the host, the tears were suddenly right there, just beneath the surface. His eyes burned with the realization that he had spent so much time chasing superficial laughter, only to miss out on the depth and beauty of true connection. He felt embarrassed, but more than that, he felt grateful. "Thank you, Morgan," the host whispered. "I think I understand now." Freeman nodded, a slight smile on his face. "It's never too late," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime. The host could feel his heart beating in his chest as Freeman's words settled into him like an anchor. He had expected to be the one in control, the one who made everyone laugh. But now, faced with Freeman's depth, the host felt as though he had been exposed, stripped of all the armor he had built over the years. He had hidden behind jokes, behind the laughter of his audience. But in this moment, he felt the full weight of his own shortcomings. Freeman had not just responded to the joke about his broken tooth. He had opened up a conversation about vulnerability, about humanity. The host couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He had spent so many years hiding behind sharp wit and quick comebacks, always afraid to show weakness. But here was a man who had lived through far more than he ever had, and yet remained steady, unshaken by the world's opinions. Morgan Freeman had shown him the power of embracing one's imperfections. The host's eyes began to sting with tears. This was not the moment he had anticipated. This was the moment of change. As the studio's lights dimmed slightly, an overwhelming silence filled the room. The audience, still shocked by the turn of events, was quiet. Even the crew behind the cameras had stopped moving, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. They were all witnessing something more profound than an interview. The host, overwhelmed with emotion, found it hard to speak. His throat was tight with the realization of what he had just been part of. Here, in front of him, was not just a star, but a man who had lived a life full of wisdom, grace, and resilience. Freeman's age, 87, was not a burden but a treasure trove of experiences that had shaped him into the figure everyone admired. His broken tooth, once the subject of mockery, now stood as a symbol of survival, of resilience. Freeman, with his quiet strength, had taught everyone in that room that it was okay to be human, to show vulnerability, to be imperfect. The host could feel his world shifting. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for teaching me what really matters." The air was thick with emotion, and for the first time, the host wasn't thinking about the next joke, the next punchline. He was simply present. As the camera's red light flickered off, signaling the end of the broadcast, Freeman stood up from his chair. He extended his hand toward the host, not in a gesture of superiority but in kindness, offering forgiveness for the mockery earlier in the show. The host, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened, reached out to shake Freeman's hand. The room was filled with a collective sigh. What had begun as a joke, an embarrassing moment for Freeman, had turned into one of the most powerful lessons ever shared on national television. Freeman looked at the host, his eyes soft with understanding. "It's not about the mistakes we make," he said. "It's about what we choose to do after we make them. Today you chose to learn." The host nodded, finally understanding the truth in Freeman's words. He had spent so much time trying to be perfect, trying to shield himself from the world. But now he knew that true strength was not in perfection. It was in being able to stand tall after falling, to learn from each step. As the cameras turned off, Freeman smiled. He had once again turned a moment of pain into a moment of grace. If you've been moved by this story, if it made you reflect on your own life and the strength we all have inside us, I encourage you to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel for more stories that touch the heart, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story made you feel and what lessons you've learned. Your support means the world to me. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can all grow.